All right, welcome back to the Protocol Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's Researcher Salon, we will be speaking with Kittel and Toby Shorin about their Summer Protocol Cohort 1 research project titled Unprotocolized Knowledge. There will be a link in the YouTube comments to the forum post where you can see some conversation about uh, their research project and or join the conversation there. Um, yeah. In our next town hall, we will be doing a guest talk with Chris Dixon from A16Z. That will be on May 1st, same time, same place. You can find out more about the Summer of Protocols, the second cohort, research from the first cohort, the program calendar, as well as more information about the protocol kit at summerofprotocols.com. So with that, I will pass it off to Tim to introduce our speakers today.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah, I guess I'll start by saying Toby and Kara were the only team we had in the Summer of Protocols last year. So I think the thing that got us to do it a bit different with the two of you is just like the breadth of things you'd covered and thought about before through other internet. So going through the archives, I went again this morning, and it's pretty wild to see like you covering everything from like how economics change on the internet, how coordination will change, how governance will change from both this like high level philosophical level and then also very practical, like analyzing specific Uniswap proposals. And yeah, when you came in with your idea, originally you wanted to study how authorship works on the internet, and you're one of the teams who also like refined their idea more and more throughout the summer. So I was actually looking. So your initial proposal was around authorship. Then by the time we had the affiliates come in midway in the program, you had switched it to frame it around credit cultures, and today the article is titled Unprotocolized Knowledge. So yeah, it's been really exciting to sort of follow your journey from like thinking about all these types of ideas before summer protocols and then having like a super quick iteration cycle over the summer that led to the essay. And also seeing what you're both up to now, which sort of feel like two very different branches of topics that we've looked at over the summer. So Toby, you've been looking much more into like human protocols with care culture and tried to dive into that more deeply. And then Kara, completely on the other side with your animation, experiential animation studio, I believe is the right framing. So yeah, it's been great having the two of you in the program, and I'm excited to just hear your perspective on your research and how it got to where it is today. So stage is yours.
Thanks, Tim. That was really sweet. It was quite a journey over the last summer. We definitely changed our idea a bazillion
times. A couple times, just a couple.
Why don't I share my screen? Oh wow, I see. Yeah, share my screen. All right, here we go. I need to go there. I'm not going to be able to look at it. Does this work, Kara?
Yeah, it does.
Okay, great. Cool. So, hello. Yeah, as some of you know, before Summer Protocols, Kara and I were working for several years on an organization called Other Internet, which was a research collective outside of academia that had many phases of its life and turned into a nonprofit, like proper institute by the end of its lifespan. And the two of us and Other Internet in general have always been interested in like how to do academic work outside of traditional academic context or like rigorous knowledge work outside of academic context. And that guided our exploration like the entire time, even though our ideas changed quite a bit.
So yeah, we already talked a little bit about how our original proposal changed a lot from where it started to where our end piece ended up. In our original proposal, we wanted to look at authorship and kind of informal authorship norms that exist in shared like hobby communities, in AI mediated creation, fandom production, all kinds of areas. We wanted to like look at the ways that the internet is putting stress on authorship norms and forcing new systems of crediting to evolve. It was a little bit broad because it included literally all of like recorded knowledge, learning, education, authorship within scope. So we wanted to try to narrow it down a little bit, but we went a couple different directions before figuring out how.
Yeah, here you can see the sorts of references we were reading at the very beginning of the project, which were definitely much more clearly around authorship, text, different sorts of craft communities, and the sorts of authorship and permissioning structures and protocols they have there. 3 months later, we were like all in on the history of science, the production of truth, and like protocols of knowledge in general. Kara, we were trying to go at the same on the same slides that we practiced with, but I think because we cut that one, we're off. So yeah. So this is an example of the sorts of mental models that we were working on towards the beginning. There were kind of 3 stages. Like first we were thinking authorship, then we realized like communities that like authorship lives in kind of knowledge communities of practice that work with ideas or knowledge, and they need to assign credit in some way, and we call that a credit culture. And these are the sorts of mental models we were working with when we had that phase of the work going on. So early June and of last year, we were asking questions like, okay, how do knowledge communities form? What sorts of institutions do they have, and what infrastructure needs to be in place for them to flourish? What's the relationship between those institutions and individual members' identities? And then looking at what we were calling discrete knowledge communities, where knowledge is packaged and protocolized through kind of regularized processes, and diffuse knowledge communities like you'd find on the internet.
So we kind of got lost in the sauce on all of that research that Toby was just talking about over the summer. And we ended up having a really useful conversation with Eric during the retreat.
The legend.
A legend, it's true. So the premises that we were working with, we kept kind of like hitting a wall and struggling because we were trying to say that like these internet knowledge communities should be producing like the same level of work as these legacy institutions, or that there's like a direct conflict between them. We realized that it's not necessarily that there's a conflict between them. It's that we need to be looking at the alliances that exist between these informal hobbyist versions of knowledge communities and those like more institutionalized academic systems. And so it's not that there's like a direct conflict between a online health community, a crypto community, or anyone that's putting out that type of knowledge work. It needs to be seen as like the alliance of the individuals who are involved in both and using the internet to form factions, gain power, and reposition themselves within the legacy structure of the academic institutions.
Yeah, naturally, like Kuhn is an inspiration there, and like the overall ideas of like how paradigms get created. So this is kind of where we ended up with it. There are a set of global knowledge protocols that produce validity within like our institutional set, and also determine the lines of conflict where new ideas will fight to be included in that set of like official protocolized knowledge. Universities and journals have been the stage for that. Now, so much of the internet or the internet has like flattened formal and informal debate and allowed informal participation in these sorts of debates. And as academics are increasingly looking to share their work with the public, these debates are moving increasingly online onto officially sanctioned platforms and unsanctioned platforms like Twitter and Instagram and TikTok.
So that left us with some new research questions. I think we probably generated like upwards of 500 research questions during this project. So are these types of knowledge, are these violations of our knowledge protocols, or are they signs of protocol insufficiencies? Do they need to evolve? Are the guardrails of scientific knowledge broken? We still don't really have like clear methods of figuring out if like these popular theories are any better than the results of like university knowledge production, which has had some scandals in the past couple of years with falsification, conflicts of interest, things like that. Is it possible to change the protocols, and do we have agency in that process? And should bro science replace science?
A very important question for all you meatheads. So here is a sketch we did yesterday that sort of illustrates how we think about the like global knowledge ecosystem. On the top, you see academic spherical cowl world where everything is beautiful, internally consistent, mathematically pure objects, both theoretically and actual mathematical objects, and that is produced by this. It's a protocol delimited realm. It has to go through the certain protocols like refereed publication, peer review, journal publication, doctorate dissertations and defenses, etc., to like become part of that world. Then there, on the other end of the spectrum, there is the dark force of social epistemology, where anything that anyone says that you like that person, you kind of just take to be true. But in between, there is this medium. This intermediary space where you have academics writing books for a popular audience and scientific communicators and public messaging from the government translating protocolized knowledge into things that are supposed to be picked up by the public sphere. And you also have what we call populist paradigms, which is the formation of knowledge spaces or knowledge about things that have like large significant consensus, but are not approved by the protocols. And we'll look at an example of that next. And in this, the Internet of Beefs in Venkat's famous article is like a really good explanation of how it kind of plays out in that intermediary zone. But in this illustration, we framed it as a rain cycle of reciprocal sense making. A slightly less violent analogy.
So as part of our scope narrowing exercise, we wanted to ground all of the theories we were coming up with and all the cool charts we were making in a specific example. So the first one that came to mind was the seed oil wars. So we wrote this last summer, and seed oils were, I think, probably in like their second year of mainstream popularity and like discussion at that point. In general, medicine and health is an area where people don't trust the establishment or have reasons to feel suspicious of the different information that's being presented. There's a lot of conflicting information with health, and there's a lot of conflicts of interest in the research done in medicine and health. So the seed oil wars as a framing example is discussed in like much greater detail in our essay. So please go read that and see all of the specific characters involved. But high level, it took the background of distrust of those academic studies and of like industry kind of polluting the results of these different rigorous studies. It took that distrustful background and it applied some charismatic narratives, some populist paradigms on top of it. And so there were a lot of figures who were kind of like spreading their own agenda and their own thoughts on seed oils. And the strong memes and proponents created like a false sense of like consensus scientifically on the subject. So the claims from the influencers may or may not have been valid, but there are valid reasons to question the scientific establishment and to be able to seed conflicting hypotheses into an industry.
So here's a 2x2 that you can use to think about those different actors that Kara was mentioning, from charismatic influencers who have their own kind of stake in the game to citizen scientists who are kind of debunking what people have to say, to regular members of academia. They all kind of fit into this spectrum of whether they're dealing with paradigm knowledge or not paradigm knowledge, and whether they're in or outside of the university. And these blobs are kind of the dynamics that happen between zones, where you can see when we're inside and out of the university, citizen science can productively happen. But where you are inside the university trying to deal with non-paradigm knowledge, there's maybe a strong tendency to exit the university, become a refugee or an exile. Thank you, Angela, for that language, I believe. And then it may be harder to differentiate you from a crank, or the university may try to portray you that way. So these are some of the other, there are other actors that have a role to play in this ecosystem of reciprocal sense-making dynamics and knowledge conflicts.
So populist paradigms and protocol problems. The established academic funding systems are really good at moving the accepted hypotheses towards clinical trials, but they do struggle to incentivize or allow high-risk frontier research. So one example of this we found that was really clear was in Alzheimer's studies. So for a couple decades, the scientists who were working outside of the predominant hypothesis in Alzheimer's, which was at the time amyloids, they were excluded from grants, excluded from publishing opportunities, and weren't able to kind of move any work outside of that dominant hypothesis forward. And because of that, there was some significant stagnation in the field, because everyone was afraid to either go outside of that dominant hypothesis or to make any claims that weren't backed up by rigorous academic study.
Yeah, and this is to say that it's not like the protocols of academia are perfect as they are. So if you recognize the same 2x2 that we just had before, here's a kind of different mapping. You can see Alzheimer's researchers are belong inside the university doing non-paradigm knowledge and are blocked from being most effective. But here are some other examples of knowledge areas and topics that are that kind of fit into these same quadrants in some way. Just let you appreciate these for a second.
For our artifact, we put together a little personality quiz that helps kind of map out what personas from that previous 2x2 you might fit into. Are you a feral scholar? Are you a paradigm participant, a paradigm refugee? All of those categories.
Or are you a PSYOP victim of somebody's crank theory?
You might be. A lot of people were getting PSYOP victim in the playtest, so it's dangerous. So we wanted to look at the evolution of knowledge protocols and if we could find examples of this happening in the past. They've been evolving all along, is what we found. Historically, journals evolved as a way to organize and formalize a lot of conversations that were happening coming from the Republic of Letters. And so there's this idea of unreasonable sufficiency of protocols, where a successful protocol will overproduce whatever it's meant to. So in this case, knowledge. So there was already as the protocol of journals evolved, it created more and more knowledge production and drastically kind of increased the amount of legitimate information available. More recently, there's been a explosion of mobile internet devices and the data that comes from mobile internet devices. So that allows for standardized capture of experiential data, so and also biometrics, so sleep and heart rate. there's so much data that is not being used, but this is kind of a sign that there is an opportunity for protocol evolution. So we see that as a way for like apps like iNaturalist, as an example, to use some of that data that's already being collected and record it and leverage it into larger studies or more self-reported experimentation.
Yep. So in facing these sorts of dynamics and thinking about that messy zone between the formalized protocols and completely unverified social sense making, we were looking at a few, here we just frame it as examples, but in our report, we frame it as desiderata for future protocol evolutions. Some of the things that we are optimistic about include transparency in the peer review process and like publicly available reviewed preprints, citizen science experiments along the lines of iNaturalist and SETI at home or protein folding, but even going beyond just data collection and quantified contribution to more substantial collaborations with the amateur academic or the amateur scientific community. Something an example of that could be self-experimentation along the lines of the potato diet trial that Substacker Slime Mold Time Mold is currently putting together. New types of funding models is something that is definitely being talked a lot and experimented a lot in DeSci without significant success so far, but we are definitely pleased to see that happening and optimistic that more funds can be transferred to people who are doing work outside the most rigorously refereed protocols. And then hobbyist communities facilitated by social platforms are also like another opportunity to leverage talented information that is being aggregated in one place. And we have an example of that in a couple minutes.
So this dynamic continues to pop up on social media. I think since we wrote this, it's obviously become even more noticeable to both of us when you see it online. A couple new examples are there's like some theoretical physicists who got into a spat both in journals and on social media recently. So they were kind of like arguing back and forth about two conflicting theories, and there were a lot of participants kind of weighing in on these more informal platforms. So that one to me kind of felt like just an example of how the conversations and the locations of these conversations are flattened on the internet. And then on the right is a very highly viewed TikTok by Kimberly Kitzero, where she's looking at comorbidities and biomechanics behind neurodivergence. This is, I think it's at 1 million something views at this point, and she has a lot of content trying to map out as a non-academic researcher all of these connections between different scientific studies. She is not able to find anyone to peer review her claims, or her claims, it's either that or her claims are not formatted in a way that they're easy for scientists to peer review. And so basically it's a very clear example of like, there are really interesting ideas and hypotheses that can emerge from these informal communities or from amateur researchers, but there aren't ways to plug those into the more formalized, protocolized knowledge spaces.
Mm-hmm. Stuff having to do with neurodivergence is like a really interesting area where we were aware of it last summer, but didn't really have time to dig into it, and have done a lot more digging over the last year. This is one area where we see a lot of opportunity for the sorts of protocol evolutions we're discussing, where there is a contested zone between like fully protocolized knowledge space around diagnoses, neurodivergence, mental health, and disease, and total folk knowledge where there's like a ton of snake oil and like charlatan therapists on TikTok who do diagnostic foreshadowing, basically telling you like if you have this or that very banal symptom, like you might be ADHD or something. And in the middle, we already see these kinds of self-diagnosing communities or more formal like chronic illness and treatment support communities online, doing a lot of great work in terms of community support. And but these the self-diagnosing segments of these communities are interacting with established therapy modalities and practices in complicated ways, as you might imagine. So there is where there's potential opportunity to bridge the emergent protocols and sense-making practices of these communities and the more formal diagnostic practices of the professional psychiatry community. That's one example where we think there's a lot of opportunity for future work, but in general, this dynamic isn't really going to go away. There's going to be more crises and more reason to distrust the university. There's going to be more unprotocolized but like pseudo-formalized knowledge work happening online. And we really do need more toolkits to bridge those knowledge spaces and bring together communities to do different types of sense-making together. Discussion time. That's it. I'm going to close out of this slide now. Thank you. And I will stop sharing and I will go back to the screen. Cool.
Cool.
Let's chop it up.
I think Josh comes back, maybe.
Okay. Okay, Josh, come back. Mediate for us. Uh-oh, Tim, you might have to be our mediator. A bird just hit my window.
Oh no.
Okay, well, why don't you post a question or an idea in the chat, or find a way to kick off conversation in the chat. Hello to all those who are watching via YouTube, including Venkat, locked out the gate today. Feels like a lot of the, let's run to this one. Kara, you might have ideas. Feels like a lot of the contested grounds will get a lot better with future real-time LLMs with hallucinations reined in to a certain degree. Agree? Disagree? What role do LLMs have to play?
I mean, it's a good question. I don't know the answer, to be honest, but I think speculation wise, the risk of LLMs right now is like very convincing looking fake information. So it's something that I think we discovered, all of us, at the beginning of Summer of Protocols. I remember people typing things into LLMs and getting fake citations spit out. And that's something that I would anticipate like continuing to happen. LLMs kind of like reify in some ways the existing protocols and like give you uncanny valley versions of the protocols of knowledge production and those citations. So like I could see some of this information that's less formal being presented as formal with that. I'm not sure about the actual like solution or like the long-term version of this with knowledge work being easier to categorize based on that. Yeah, it looks like Eric has a question too.
Eric has a question, but he needs to clarify it because I don't understand it. Eric asks, what are the margins of change that disruption in knowledge protocols is likely to bring about, or is likely to bring? And which ones are we most excited about? But I'm not sure I understand what margins of change means. Yes, change in knowledge protocols is likely to change society. Which are the social changes you're stoked on? Ooh. That's a really good question. I guess, I mean, one thing I think we alluded to in the beginning that we are definitely stoked on is like enabling participation of like people like ourselves or younger versions of ourselves in like real work. Everything I've been involved in my career has been some kind of educational institution, and the spirit of real learning and real what we just described in the last line of the essay as the continuous tradition of learning is something that's really important to me, and I think to all of the other internet community. So I think we are, we in our work emerged at a time when like indie research was a kind of emergent meme to capture misfits who were doing knowledge work outside of academia and more from a tech context. Now, as Nadia, who also was who identified that way, put recently, like that the utility of that kind of framing has lost itself, is no longer that relevant. And now there are lots of like smaller research institutions like other internet. But I still think we're in an intermediate, like 30 to 50 year phase where new models for people to participate in serious knowledge production that like gets embedded in social protocols, in social functions, in infrastructure, are in their nascency and like getting built out. I think so. The overall thing I hope to see is like less gatekeeping and more like fluid participation in protocols that like contribute to social development and like the overall growth of knowledge.
Timber asked which academic domains we think are least likely to be disrupted by these newer forms of knowledge creation. This one, I would say it probably depends on what timescale you're talking about. Like, it obviously is going to be harder for people to participate in things that require like a lot of funding or a lot of specialized equipment. Right now, that's like a barrier to entry for like informal and newer forms of knowledge creation. I would foresee that changing pretty quickly as technology improves and more things like biometric devices become publicly available and easy to obtain for citizen science. We kind of had to exclude some areas of knowledge production from the scope of our research outside of science because we were finding it to be too muddy of an area. So I might say one of those, like for the less easily like verifiable or falsifiable areas of knowledge production, it's a blurrier line.
All right. Sorry about the little drop there. My internet died for a second. Looks like Venka has got a question from the YouTube crowd. His question is posted on the screen, and it is, when can wisdom of crowds rise at the level of peer review of the crowds? And below that, he says, the superconducting thing was popular on social media, but only 1 to 2 amateurs actually tried replicating it. I'm talking actual peer reviews where N is greater than 100 people participating in the critical reviewing.
Mm-hmm. Good question. I mean, one way of framing it is the way that we LK99 thing like happened while we were in end stages of this project, and the way we analyzed it and thought about it was not from the perspective of how can we maximize the number of participants, but more on the level of like university distrust. It was because this superconductor thing turned into a kind of like social multiverse event that tons of people in the world are paying attention to, that the public was able to like follow and accept the consensus on its lack of replication so quickly. So it more seemed to us like a case study in science communication rather than participatory science. But there are other ideas. There are potentially other ideas there.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, so I don't know exactly where you guys ended up with the questions. So
the last one we did before this was Timber's question.
No,
cool.
no question.
Yeah, let me just, Janot's got a question. Looks like her device is not connected, so we can't bring her onto the screen. But what kinds of advantages occur with people whose health conditions have less of an online presence, like, say, conditions involving older demographics of people where they have fewer opportunities to participate in online, unprotocolized knowledge communities?
I mean, I think this one kind of follows a similar pattern to like certain people whose health conditions are disadvantaged in like the protocolized knowledge community. So there are certain things where it's less likely that people are directly participating online informally, like older people who aren't as familiar with technology. That will probably change as people who are familiar with technology get older. But I would compare that to like there are a lot of people who have direct firsthand experience with different health conditions, and those health conditions can specifically be a barrier to them participating in formal knowledge production. Maybe they didn't finish college because of them, or maybe they don't have the same energy levels to be able to kind of like participate in formal academic settings. Those could also even impact informal settings as well, of being able to like put the time into participating in those communities. So I feel like that one requires kind of like advocacy and people who are excited in each version of the system to participate on behalf of those they know.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. Any other questions from YouTube or from the backstage area here? Dorian's got a lot of notes. Is there a specific question there? Maybe we bring Dorian on stage. He likes to chat here.
I like to. Is that my reputation? As I like to chat. I mean, I guess what got me sort of thinking was just the TikTok neuro scientist thing was interesting because I mean, her sort of hypothesis was not in a format that could be consumed, and that made me sort of thinking about like how like what if there was a phenomenological bug tracker, like a GitHub for hypotheses, like if the protocol is getting the hypothesis into a format that can be consumed in a location that people know about so they can go and look, or is like a Reddit, can you upvote the hypothesis kind of thing. But like being able to tag it or type it almost as a format, I don't know. I mean, that got me. That was just sort of the prompt. I don't know if you want to riff on that for a second. If you found anything like that.
I mean, that's pretty interesting. I guess that these qualitative experience reporting is like really hard in general, and there is this group called the Coilia Research Institute that has like built a custom, like a special purpose tool for experience reporting on very like micro detailed like phenomenology of acid trips and like DMT trips, but I don't know if it extends well to like assessments for if you're neurodivergent or not. I guess like there is a movement to bring that kind of like self-experience reporting and like environmental monitoring into like clinical psychology work, because they're because increasingly like the focus of the work is like what happens outside the room, and like understanding like when people have nervous system like dysregulated reactions in the world. But I think those tools are like pretty shitty and require people to generally like describe their experiences. So I'm not, I haven't seen something that like really impressed me so far.
And kind of in a similar way, there are a lot of like decentralized science types of ideas that are kind of similar to that have like user submissions or tagging or kind of like crowdsourced organization of scientific information. I haven't seen like all of the latest developments in that space, so I'm not sure the current status of it, but like those also kind of struggled from being able to differentiate useful participation or how to incentivize the right kind of participation without getting a lot of spam.
Yeah, I would imagine that the like just being able to put down an experience without trying to theorize about it is kind of a discipline that you gotta train up almost. But that, I guess, it's almost in the protocol realm. Anyway, I will open this slot up for other people, but thank you.
Anonymous YouTube user with the hat has some nice questions.
Yep, they just popped in here. The YouTube user is asking, what are your thoughts on BJ's BP 500 Citizen Science Project?
I don't know what that is, and I have asked them, so they might respond. But they had another question around how we see our own place as serious researchers outside the academy, and I'm sure, Kara, you and I might have different answers to that question as people who have cycled between practice and academia in different ways. What about you?
I would say that the place that I want to be is kind of as a connector or as a bridge between those informal and formal spaces. I based on that example from TikTok or based on many of like the social media examples, I'm pretty familiar with like the informal style of participation that people have online, and like also spend a lot of time, I would say, and Toby knows this, trying to find like corners of the internet that aren't visited very often or that only have like 5 very dedicated fans posting. So as my place outside of the academy, I want to try to like form those connections or help translate between the more informal participation that seems valuable and the more formal and credentialed types of academia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you're more willing to and historically have actually engaged with like academics who are focused on those corners like more than I have, which is cool. Speaking for myself, like this is a question I've been thinking about as I'm now spending my time like focused on mental health and wellness, and frankly the most interesting developments there are not really happening in the university. With regard to like the self-diagnosing communities, there's like 4 people who are working on that in the university, like context, as far as I've been able to find, who have like groups, like actual research, like labs who are focused on the issue, for example. On the other hand, a lot of the innovation that seems to need to happen in those spaces are coming from integrative practitioners, like mind-body practitioners, people who are trying to build like holistic clinics. And they have not been like theorized or studied that successfully. So I guess I currently see my role as there's this kind of like field building meme I would say that's going around right now, but like having worked on other internet for 5 years and feeling like we really did put together a unique mix of people asking the right questions that had an influence in crypto, I kind of feel more confident in my role as like a field builder. And maybe the historical like reference point would be like a Norbert Wiener or Stuart Brand or Tim O'Reilly, like 3 people who, well, they all modeled their career after Norbert Wiener and tried very intentionally to put together academics and practitioners and people in places like with new questions to have like a larger impact. I think that's kind of the type of role lineage that I more see other internet and like myself having played.
Awesome, thanks. Question from Nate Angel in the YouTube asking, did you look at protocols like DOIs or ORCIDs and the relationships that they have with citizen science?
We did a little bit, but then that was kind of in the part of our project where we were trying to cut down on the amount of new information that we were looking into, so we didn't end up going super deep on it.
Cool, fair enough. Another question from Barryovich. Which institutions would need to onboard to form these citizen academia protocols? How can we incentivize them?
Awesome question.
Yeah, that's a good question. That is kind of the question. Like, one of the ideas that came up in, summer protocols among the whole cohort was the idea of being a protocol entrepreneur. Which is not really a defined term, but it's something that you can kind of imagine what it might be. A standards entrepreneur, I think, actually is how David Lang phrased it. I think there need to be. It's less institutions and more people at this point. People with deep subject matter expertise who see an opportunity for protocol improvement. I don't know. If you see it, if you see something, say something. You have a responsibility to do it, in my mind. But I can't really speak about incentives. Maybe
I was going to say that we looked at kind of like the other side of this question, which is like trying to figure out what the perverse incentives of the current academic system are and what is stopping certain types of research from being done. Because obviously there are infinite hypotheses that are possible to test, but much like the Alzheimer's example, not all of them get the same amount of attention. And some of them people are actively discouraged from pursuing because they're worried about their career being stalled because of it. So I think like the institutions in terms of like what the next steps would be or what would be helpful in this field, it's like identifying those areas where there is some kind of stagnation or some kind of barrier to doing these different types of research, and potentially having like those maybe external to academia institutions that are able to fund some of the preliminary research, or at least get support behind the idea of looking into a hypothesis.
Awesome. Thank you. Question from Timber. Maybe we'll bring him into the stage. And Timber, you want to ask a question live here?
Hey, another question I had was, is the usability of research findings an important factor in which fields are going to get disrupted first? So for the seed oils war, for example, it was very easy for people to implement that change. Like, oh, seed oils are bad, just cut it out of your diet. And that's why there's this sort of demand for it and pickup on the consumer side. And that goes for a lot of these like health research things. But for example, on the other hand, you have Alzheimer research about the mechanisms behind that. And there's not really a clear conclusion as to what individuals should do with that information. So maybe there's less uptake of that research more broadly. Not a great question there, but if you guys can riff off that.
Yeah, I think that probably like it obviously is a factor in what these types of what topics encourage this type of informal participation. Stuff that like personally affects you, or stuff that is like a specific type of special interest, is going to have more participation than like more granular topics, I guess. I think seed oils is kind of it. A lot of nutrition science falls into this category, probably partially because of what you're saying with like easy changes to implement, but also because it's one of the areas that's like it's historically had a lot of contested research, even within the established like protocolized academic spaces. There's a lot of conflicting studies and a lot of like industry motivated and industry funded studies that have had differing information. So I think it's kind of like an area, it depends on like personal interest, but also what areas have that distrust already.
Makes sense.
Can we tackle Juan Diosdado's very, very challenging question? How can the truth be protected?
Sure, yeah. We'll put that on screen here. And his question is, how can the truth be protected when so many people prefer to participate in massively shared delusions that allow them to post challenging emotions or effort?
Wow. Well, that's basically one of the main questions there is to answer at this time. And I don't really have a great answer to this one, but I do want to link to a very interesting essay that I read in the last 4 months that proposes an answer, which I'll post in the YouTube chat. It's called "Everyone." This comment has failed to post to Protocol Town Hall. Great job, StreamYard. Okay, well, the essay is called "Everyone's Existential Crisis," and it's on Palladium by somebody named Mia Perry. And the whole framing of like dark force of social epistemology that I used earlier was kind of inspired by this essay. This essay is basically an attempt to reframe like the so-called meaning crisis in terms of like a social epistemology crisis, where we use hearsay and social sense making, and just listening to what people we like who tell us and taking that as truth in order to organize like the vast majority of our lives. So one thing to note is that most people participate in massively shared delusions, and that the literal function of those delusions is to postpone challenging emotions, right? We are all, none of us have firsthand direct knowledge of any of the science that like our world works on. We just take it for granted, and we take it for granted from other people who take it for granted. So postponing what the problem that this essay talks about is that the kind of social reward feedback loops have become disintermediated by like social media feedback loops and parasocial relationships, where we end up like believing in and being socially rewarded for believing in like other kinds of shared delusions, and then our like actual immediate relationships with others, like in the local sense, are no longer function. The author of this essay is a psychologist and like has a psychologist solution, which is basically do psychology and try to notice when you are when a conflict with others that is really an emotional conflict is being mediated through some kind of knowledge conflict that, or like discursive disagreement that you're having with them, which I don't find particularly satisfying. But I do think that this whole essay is like probably the best thing I've read that like addresses this question that you bring up.
Awesome. I'm not seeing any other questions right offhand here.
Wow. We've answered all the questions, Josh.
Yeah,
I think we can,
everything is decided and figured out. Good job.
We can close Harvard University up.
Indeed.
There's no more questions.
Cool. Well, any last thoughts from you guys before we wrap it up here? All right. Well, in that case, thank you so much for sharing your research project with us today, and for all the collaboration and just hard work you did during Summer Protocols 1. And yeah, thanks again. For everyone else, we will see you all next week for another guest talk in the Protocol Town Hall series with Chris Dixon from A16Z. So thanks a lot, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank
Cool.
you.
All right. See you.
Bye.